The saloon in Redstone, Nevada, glowed under the flickering light of oil lamps as Abigail Thornton sat alone at a corner table, her chessboard spread out before her. The clink of glasses and the low hum of conversation filled the air, but her focus was on the carved wooden pieces, each one a small masterpiece of cedar and oak. A soft creak of the saloon's swinging doors broke her concentration. She glanced up, expecting another rowdy cowboy, but instead saw a lanky man in dusty work clothes, carrying a broom and a bucket with quiet purpose. Abigail noticed him pause, his eyes catching the chessboard. On a whim, fueled by the loneliness of a life spent wrangling cattle and outsmarting rivals, she flashed a confident grin and said, "Beat me at chess, stranger, and I'll marry you." The man stopped, his hazel eyes meeting hers with a steady intensity. "Name's Caleb," he said, voice low but firm. "And I play for keeps." Abigail Thornton was a legend in Redstone, a woman who'd turned her late father's small ranch into one of the largest cattle operations in Nevada. At 32, she was a force of nature, her sharp mind cutting through land disputes and trade deals like a well-aimed lasso. She had wealth, respect, and a reputation that made men think twice before crossing her. But love? That was a frontier she'd never conquered. Every suitor either wanted her fortune or wilted under her fierce independence. She'd grown weary of their games long ago. The chessboard was her refuge, a gift from her father, who'd taught her the game under the stars on their old porch. Before fever claimed him, he'd shown her how to think 3 moves ahead, a skill she'd carried from the ranch to the rough-and-tumble world of cattle barons. On the board, life made sense. Every move had a purpose, every choice carried weight. It was her escape from the chaos of running an empire she'd never meant to inherit. Caleb Wheeler lived in a different world, one of sweat and survival. At 36, he was a hired hand, moving through Redstone's dusty streets with the quiet efficiency of a man who went unnoticed unless something broke. His calloused hands carried more than a broom. They bore the weight of raising his daughter, Ellie, alone. Once, he'd been a chess prodigy, a young man who dazzled at tournaments in dusty frontier towns, his strategies as sharp as a gunslinger's aim. But that was before his wife, Mary, passed, before Ellie's lung sickness started stealing her breath in the night, before doctor's bills forced him to trade his dreams for a steady wage. Caleb scrubbed saloon floors and mended fences for $2 a day, the kind of work that came with enough to keep Ellie's medicine stocked and their small cabin warm. His old life as a chess player felt like a tale from someone else's book, buried under the dust of necessity. Ellie, his 7-year-old daughter, was his world now, a bright, curious girl with her mother's gentle smile and her father's quick wit. Her coughing fits were getting worse, though, each one a reminder of how fragile their life was. At home, a worn chess set sat on their table, a relic of his past that Ellie loved to tinker with, even if she didn't know the moves. The saloon grew quieter as Caleb stepped toward the chess table, his boots scuffing softly on the wooden floor. Abigail had expected him to laugh off her challenge, to tip his hat and shuffle away, restoring the natural order of their worlds. Instead, he studied the board with the focus of a man sizing up a stampede. "You're playing a King's Indian setup," he said, easing into the chair across from her, his movements betraying a confidence that didn't match his worn clothes. "You like to bide your time, control the center late. Solid choice." His words caught her off guard, a spark of surprise flickering in her chest. This wasn't some cowpoke fumbling with pawns. "You know your way around a board," she said, her tone teasing but her eyes sharp, reassessing the man before her. Up close, she saw the intelligence in his gaze, the way he carried himself like someone used to being overlooked. "You sure you want to take me up on this?" Caleb's lips twitched into a half-smile that changed his whole face, softening the hard lines carved by years of labor. "I don't lose often," he said simply. "Do you?" "Never," Abigail replied, leaning forward as she reset the board. "Let's see what you've got, Caleb." What followed was a chess game unlike any she'd ever played. Caleb's moves were smooth, deliberate, each one building on the last like a well-planned cattle drive. His opening was textbook but clever, claiming the board's center while keeping his strategy veiled. By the 10th move, Abigail felt her usual confidence slipping. By the 15th, she was fighting to hold her ground. His pieces moved with a precision that felt almost surgical, each advance part of a larger plan she couldn't quite see. "Check," Caleb said softly, his bishop sliding into a position that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Abigail's heart raced as she scanned the board, her mind racing through defenses that collapsed under scrutiny. She moved her king, but the noose was tightening. "Check," he said again, his knight cutting off another escape. Her hands grew clammy, a feeling she hadn't known since her first big cattle deal years ago. The third checkmate came like a thunderclap across the plains. Caleb's voice was calm, no hint of gloating, just a quiet satisfaction as he leaned back. The board told the story of her defeat, her king trapped in a web of his pieces, no moves left. The game had ended in 20 moves, and Abigail Thornton, who'd built her empire on outsmarting everyone, had been outplayed by a man she'd barely noticed before. She tipped her king over, the small gesture feeling like the most honest thing she'd done in years. "You hustled me," she said, her voice sharp with a mix of admiration and wounded pride. "You let me think you were just some drifter who stumbled into a saloon." Caleb began resetting the board, his hands moving with the care of a ritual. "I never said I was just a drifter," he replied evenly. "You saw my clothes and my broom and decided that for yourself. There's a difference." The words stung, forcing Abigail to face the arrogance that had led her to underestimate him. She'd sized him up as a simple laborer, never imagining a mind like his could exist outside her world of ranchers and tycoons. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" she asked, curiosity overriding her embarrassment. "That wasn't luck. You took me apart like you'd done it 100 times. Caleb finished placing the last pawn and met her gaze. "Had some good teachers back in the day," he said, his tone hinting at a story he wasn't ready to share. "Chess used to be my life. Then other things took over." He stood, grabbing his broom and bucket. "Thanks for the game, Miss Thornton," he said, tipping his hat slightly before heading toward the saloon's back door. Abigail watched him go, the chessboard now feeling like a challenge she hadn't expected to face. The saloon seemed smaller without him, as if his presence had shifted something fundamental in her world. The days following the chess match in Redstone's saloon were restless ones for Abigail Thornton. The memory of Caleb's quiet checkmate gnawed at her, not because she'd lost, but because of how effortlessly he'd seen through her. She'd built her life on reading people, cowhands, rival ranchers, even crooked land agents, but Caleb Wheeler had slipped past her defenses like a shadow. His hazel eyes and steady hands lingered in her thoughts, disrupting her focus as she rode the range or balanced the ranch's ledgers. By Thursday, she found herself digging into Caleb's past, using her connections in town to pull information from the local sheriff's records and the saloon's owner. She told herself it was due diligence, the kind of thing a smart rancher did before trusting anyone new. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Late that evening, alone in her ranch house, she sat by the firelight, poring over what she'd found. Caleb Wheeler, 36, widowed, one daughter, Ellie, aged 7. No criminal record, no debts beyond the usual for a working man. But tucked away in the saloon owner's gossip was a detail that hit her like a hoof to the chest. Caleb had been a chess prodigy, a name whispered in gambling halls and frontier tournaments from Cheyenne to Santa Fe. Old newspaper clippings from the 1870s painted him as a teenage sensation, a prairie genius who'd outplayed seasoned players with a flair that left crowds stunned. He'd been on the cusp of bigger things, maybe even a shot at national fame, when he vanished from the circuit. The reason came in a faded obituary notice. Mary Wheeler died of consumption 5 years ago, leaving behind her husband and a toddler. Caleb had walked away from chess at the height of his skill, trading tournaments for long hours mending fences and cleaning saloons to keep his daughter fed and doctored. The sacrifice was staggering, A man who'd traded a glittering future for the gritty reality of fatherhood. Abigail stared at the papers, her whiskey untouched on the table. She judged him by his worn boots and dusty hat, never guessing he'd given up more than she'd ever dared to risk. The next morning, Abigail rode into town, her mind a tangle of guilt and curiosity. She meant to find Caleb, to apologize for her assumptions and maybe challenge him to another game. But fate had other plans. As she tethered her horse outside the general store, she heard a commotion near the livery stable. A man's voice, sharp with fear, calling for help. She followed the sound and found Caleb kneeling beside a small girl, her face pale and her breathing a ragged wheeze. Ellie's lips were tinged blue, her eyes wide with panic as she clutched her father's hand. "Ellie, darlin', just hold on," Caleb was saying, his voice steady but his hands trembling as he held an empty laudanum bottle, useless against her attack. "The doc's comin'." Abigail didn't hesitate. She dropped her saddlebag and pulled a silver whistle from her belt, its shrill cry cutting through the dusty air to summon the town's doctor. "This is Abigail Thornton," she barked when the doctor arrived, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who moved mountains. "Get this girl to your clinic now. If you need supplies or a specialist from Carson City, I'll cover it. Move." The next hour was a blur of dust and urgency. Ellie carried to the doctor's office, Caleb's face taut as he held her hand, Abigail barking orders to ensure the girl got the best care. She followed them to the clinic, her presence smoothing the way as the doctor administered a breathing treatment. Standing in the cramped waiting area, surrounded by the smell of carbolic acid and the sound of Ellie's labored breaths, Abigail felt useless for the first time in years. Her money and influence could open doors, but they couldn't make a little girl breathe. Hours later, Caleb emerged from the treatment room, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion but his eyes clear of the panic that had gripped him earlier. "She's stable," he said, his voice rough. "Doc says the new tincture's helping. She might be home by morning if she keeps improving." He paused, meeting Abigail's gaze. "Thank you. You didn't have to do all that." Abigail nodded, her throat tight. She saw the weight of what her help had meant, not just the money, but the speed and certainty she'd brought to a moment of chaos. "I wanted to," she said simply. "I'm glad she's okay." Over the next week, Abigail and Caleb found themselves crossing paths more often, though neither admitted the encounters were anything but chance. Abigail took to lingering in town during Caleb's shifts at the saloon, pretending to check on her horses or haggle at the general store. Caleb, in turn, seemed to find more reasons to sweep the boardwalk near her usual haunts. Their conversations started small, talk of the weather, the price of cattle, but grew into something deeper, a rhythm that felt as natural as a desert breeze. Abigail's ranch hands noticed the change first. The woman who'd once driven them with a stare that could stop a stampede now smiled more, her laughter startling men who'd only known her as the iron-willed boss. For Caleb, Abigail's interest was like a spark in a dry season. He'd grown used to being invisible, his mind dismissed as just another laborer's. But Abigail asked about his chess days with genuine curiosity, about Ellie with warmth, about his work with respect for the effort it took to keep a child alive in a hard world. Ellie, sharp as a tack, started asking about Miss Abigail, the lady who'd helped at the clinic and made her pa smile in a way she hadn't seen since her ma was alive. The three began spending time together, quiet afternoons by the creek where Ellie could splash while Caleb and Abigail talked, or suppers at the boarding house where Abigail marveled at the easy bond between father and daughter. She found herself drawn to Ellie's chatter, the girl's bright questions reminding her of a time when she'd been curious about everything, before the ranch and its responsibilities had hardened her edges. Their growing closeness felt like a well-played chess game, each moment building on the last, natural and inevitable. But the Wild West was a small world, and Abigail's prominence as Redstone's richest rancher meant their private moments wouldn't stay private for long. Trouble was brewing, and it would come in a form that would test the fragile connection they'd begun to build. The trouble started on a dusty Tuesday morning when a sketchy drawing surfaced in Redstone's local gazette. Someone, a nosy stable hand named Jasper Cole, had scribbled a caricature of Abigail Thornton and Caleb Wheeler playing chess in the saloon, her bold challenge scrawled in exaggerated letters above them. "Beat me and I'll marry you." The caption below read, "When the cattle queen bets her heart on a game and the hired hand wins in 3 moves. Legal or just loco?" The paper, passed around in saloons and mercantiles, sparked laughter and whispers that spread like wildfire through Redstone's streets. By noon, the whole town was buzzing. Ranch hands swapped theories over whiskey, shopkeepers gossiped with customers, and Abigail's own foreman fielded questions about whether the boss lady had lost her senses. The sketch wasn't just a joke. It was a public airing of Abigail's impulsive moment, twisted into a spectacle that painted her as a reckless woman and Caleb as a schemer after her fortune. The townsfolk's chatter grew sharp, laced with the kind of small-town judgment that cut deep. "She's too good for a hired man. He's just chasing her land. What's a rich lady doing with a nobody like that?" Abigail first heard about it when her ranch manager, Clara, rode up to the house with a copy of the Gazette, her face grim. "Miss Thornton, you need to see this," she said, handing over the crumpled paper. Abigail's stomach dropped as she studied the crude drawing, her voice from that night echoing in her mind. The comments in the saloon that day, overheard as she walked past, were worse, a mix of snickers about her spinster status and snide remarks about Caleb's motives. The reputation she'd built as Redstone's unshakable cattle queen was being picked apart by people who knew nothing of her heart. Her day was a storm of interruptions. Ranchers she'd done business with sent writers with polite inquiries about her judgment. The town's banker hinted that such gossip could spook investors. Worst of all was a letter from her uncle, Ezekiel Thornton, a silent partner in the ranch who lived in Carson City. His words were cold as a winter wind. "Abigail, this nonsense about marrying a hired hand is unbecoming. The ranch's name is at stake. Your father would be ashamed." That evening, Abigail tracked Caleb down outside the saloon, where he was stacking crates in the fading light. Her temper, frayed by the day's humiliations, snapped like a brittle twig. "Did you know about that damn sketch?" she demanded, her voice low but sharp enough to cut leather. "Was this some kind of play to make me look like a fool in front of the whole town?" Caleb set down a crate, his face hardening into the guarded look of a man used to taking blows without flinching. "I didn't know anyone was drawing us," he said, his tone even. "I don't play games like that, Abigail. I thought you knew me better." "Knew you?" she shot back, her words edged with the pain of public scrutiny. "I thought I did, until you turned a chess game into a town scandal. You waltz in, beat me in front of everyone, and now I'm the laughingstock of Redstone. Was that the plan? Humiliate the rich lady for a laugh?" Caleb's eyes darkened, but his voice stayed calm, cutting deeper for its restraint. "I played chess, same as I've always done. You made an offer you didn't mean, and I won a game you didn't think I could. That's not a hustle, it's just what happened." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You want to know what I think? I think you're mad at yourself for letting me in, and now you're looking for someone to blame." The truth in his words stung worse than the gossip. Abigail felt her anger falter, replaced by a sinking realization that she'd lashed out at the one person who'd seen her as more than a title or a fortune. "You think you're so noble," she said, her voice quieter now, but still sharp. "The poor worker who's above it all. You must love watching us high and mighty types squirm." Caleb's jaw tightened, the first crack in his calm. "You want to know what I'm laughing at? Myself. For thinking you were different. For believing someone who runs half of Nevada might understand what it means to give up everything for someone you love. But you're just like the rest. Everyone's a threat, everything's a deal." He turned, grabbing his broom and heading back into the saloon. "I've got work to do." Abigail stood frozen, the weight of his words settling like dust after a stampede. She'd spent her life building walls to protect her empire, but in that moment, she saw how those walls had kept out the one person who'd made her feel alive. The saloon doors swung shut behind him, leaving her alone in the twilight, the Gazette's sketch crumpled in her fist. The next few days were a blur of damage control. Abigail leaned on her influence to get the Gazette's editor to print a retraction, but the damage was done. The sketch had been copied, passed around, even tacked up in a rival saloon. She threw herself into ranch work, riding the range until dark to avoid the knowing glances of her hands and the whispers that followed her in town. Caleb's absence was a quiet ache, his usual haunts empty as he kept his distance. Then, on a chilly Thursday afternoon, her foreman rushed into the ranch house, his face pale. "It's Caleb's girl Ellie," he said. "She's taken bad again. They're at the docks now, but it sounds serious." Abigail's heart lurched. She grabbed her hat and rode into town, the memory of Ellie's blue-tinged lips spurring her faster than any cattle drive. At the clinic, she found Caleb sitting beside Ellie's bed, his face etched with the kind of fear only a parent could know. The little girl was hooked to a breathing contraption, her small chest rising and falling with effort. "Doc says it's worse this time," Caleb said, his voice hollow as he met Abigail's eyes. "They're talking about specialists in Denver, maybe new treatment. Costs more than I'll ever see." Abigail wanted to offer to pay, to throw her wealth at the problem like she always did, but the look on Caleb's face stopped her. He wasn't a man who took charity lightly, and she'd already wounded his pride once. Instead, she sat across from him, her voice soft. "What can I do, Caleb? Tell me how to help." He shook his head, exhaustion dulling his hazel eyes. "Some things you can't fix, Abigail. Some things just are." The resignation in his voice broke something in her. She'd spent her life believing every problem could be solved with enough grit or gold, but here was a man facing a fight no amount of money could win. "I'm sorry," she said, the words heavy with regret for more than just their fight. "For what I said outside the saloon. For thinking you'd use me. I was wrong about you, Caleb, and I hate that I was." He looked at her, his gaze softening just enough to let her breathe again. "You were scared," he said. "People say things they don't mean when they're scared. I get it. Do you forgive me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing to forgive," he said, but there was a sadness in his tone that cut deeper than anger. "I just hoped you'd be different." They sat in silence, the hum of the clinic's equipment filling the space between them. Ellie's breathing steadied as the night wore on, the doctor's treatments easing her struggle. Abigail stayed, not because she could fix anything, but because leaving felt like abandoning something she was only beginning to understand. In that small, sterile room, watching Caleb hold his daughter's hand, she saw what love really cost, a lesson her empire had never taught her. The days after Ellie's hospital stay settled into an uneasy quiet in Redstone. Abigail Thornton threw herself into ranch work, driving her hands harder than usual to drown out the echoes of her fight with Caleb and the lingering sting of the town's gossip. But her thoughts kept drifting to the clinic, to Ellie's fragile breaths and Caleb's steady presence beside her. She'd misjudged him, and the weight of that mistake sat heavier than any cattle deal gone sour. On a crisp Saturday morning, Abigail made a choice that would have shocked her ranch hands, who knew her as a woman who never acted without a plan. She saddled her mare and rode to Caleb's small cabin on the edge of town, a modest place with a sagging porch and a garden where wildflowers fought for space among the weeds. She had no strategy, only a need to try again. When she knocked, Ellie answered, her face pale but brightening at the sight of her. "Miss Abigail," she said, her voice still raspy from the ordeal. "Pa's fixin' breakfast. Want some flapjacks?" The simple warmth of the scene, Caleb in the tiny kitchen, flipping pancakes, Ellie's drawings scattered across a worn table, caught Abigail off guard. It was a life built on love, not land or profit, and it made her chest ache with something she couldn't name. Caleb looked up, his hazel eyes wary but softening as Ellie tugged Abigail inside. "She's been talkin' about you," he said, nodding toward his daughter. "Says you're her hero from the clinic." Abigail flushed, unaccustomed to being anyone's hero. I just did what needed doin', she said, taking a seat as Ellie proudly showed her a chessboard on the table, its pieces chipped but arranged with care. Pa's teachin' me, Ellie said, her eyes sparkling. Wanna play? What followed was a lesson in more than chess. Ellie played with a child's reckless joy, her moves breaking every rule Abigail knew but brimming with imagination. She giggled as she moved a pawn diagonally, declaring it a brave scout sneaking past enemy lines. You're not playin' to win, Abigail said, not criticizing but genuinely curious. Winnin's not the best part, Ellie replied, her small face serious. The best part's the story you make while you play. The words hit Abigail like a desert sunrise, simple but blinding. She'd spent years chasing victories, land, deals, respect, never pausing to savor the moments that led to them. With Ellie, chess wasn't about outsmarting an opponent, it was about connection, a shared dance across the board. Caleb joined them, and the three played a chaotic, made-up version of chess where Ellie called the shots, inventing rules that turned knights into cattle rustlers and bishops into wandering preachers. Laughter filled the cabin, easing the tension from their last encounter. Abigail felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the armor she'd worn since her father's death. I brought something, she said, pulling a small package from her saddlebag. Inside was a new chess set, carved from pine and mesquite, each piece polished to catch the morning light. Ellie's eyes widened as she ran her fingers over a knight's tiny carved mane. It's so pretty, she whispered. Is it really mine? All yours, Abigail said, her voice catching at the girl's delight. Your pa says you're gettin' good. Thought you deserved a proper set. Caleb watched, his expression cycling through surprise and gratitude, landing on something deeper that made Abigail's pulse quicken. You didn't have to do that, he said softly, but his tone carried an understanding of the gesture, not a handout but a peace offering, a way to mend what her harsh words had broken. I wanted to, Abigail replied, holding his gaze. I've been thinkin' about what you said, about sacrificin' for what matters. I've been playin' the wrong game, Caleb. All my life, I thought winning was everything. But I'm startin' to see it ain't. They talked as Ellie arranged her new chess pieces into a story only she understood. The conversation was careful at first, navigating the raw edges of their fight, but it grew easier, like a trail smoothing out under steady hoofbeats. Caleb shared his plans for Ellie's care, talks with a Denver specialist, the constant juggle of hope and hard reality. Abigail opened up about the ranch, the weight of running it alone, the loneliness of being the woman everyone respected but no one really knew. She admitted the Gazette sketch had shaken her, not just because of the gossip, but because it forced her to see how much she cared about what Caleb thought of her. The ranch council's talkin' about my leadership, she said, her voice steady but vulnerable. Uncle Ezekiel thinks I've tarnished the Thornton name. Maybe he's right. Caleb leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. You scared of losin' the ranch? Abigail thought for a moment. 6 months ago, the idea would have gutted her. The ranch was her father's legacy, her life's work. But sitting in this cramped cabin, watching Ellie hum as she played, Caleb's quiet strength anchoring the room, she realized her fears had changed. I'm scared of losin' this, she said, gesturing to the three of them, the warmth of the morning, the fragile hope of something real. This matters more than any deed or dollar. 2 months later, the scene shifted to a small ranch house they'd bought together, a sturdy place with a wide porch and enough land for Ellie to run free. The chess set sat on a table under the cottonwood tree, its pieces catching the golden light of a Sunday afternoon. Their weekly games had become a ritual, less about checkmates than about the simple joy of being together. Ellie read nearby, sprawled in the grass with a book, while Abigail and Caleb moved pieces across the board, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. Caleb's face had lost its haunted edge, softened by the new treatments the Denver specialist had prescribed for Ellie. Her breathing was steadier, her episodes less frequent, and for the first time, Caleb could see a future beyond the next doctor's visit. Abigail, too, had changed. She still ran the ranch with an iron hand, but she'd learned to let go of the need to control every outcome, finding freedom in the moments that couldn't be planned. "Your move," Caleb said, leaning back with a grin that made Abigail's heart skip, the same way it had that first night in the saloon when he'd checkmated her in 20 moves. She studied the board, not plotting a victory but savoring the game itself. The position was tricky, a knight fork she'd been setting up for half a dozen moves. "If I play this," she said, tapping the knight, "and you do what I think you will, I might actually beat you this time." Caleb chuckled, his eyes glinting with the old chess prodigy's mischief. "Might," he teased. "Or I might surprise you. Done it before." Ellie looked up from her book, her face serious with the wisdom only a child could wield. "Maybe you don't have to beat each other," she said. "Maybe winning is just playin' together." Abigail and Caleb shared a look, both recognizing the truth in Ellie's words. The real game wasn't on the board. It was in the life they were building, move by move, choice by choice. Abigail reached for Caleb's hand, feeling the calluses that told a story of sacrifice and strength. "She's right," she said, smiling. "I think we've already won." The chess pieces sat untouched as laughter filled the air, the sound carrying across the ranch like a promise. The game on the board could wait. The one that mattered, the one played in love and trust, was already theirs.